Hello again. Michael McGovern back with you here. Day whatever of the pandemic. I don't want to think about it. We're quarantine story timing here and keeping our friends and neighbors who are in nursing homes, retirement homes throughout the Northwoods area of Wisconsin, keeping you company. Whether you're in a retirement home or whether you're just at home and would like a little visit once a day or so, then we're happy to provide it. So, we're reading the great David Maraniss' When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. We are up to chapter 7 here, and he is, at this point, as an offensive coach for Army, for legendary coach Colonel Red Blake. They had a fantastic season. They were looking undefeated and heading towards, just absolute an all-time season. Towards the end of the year, facing their arch rival Navy, who was way down. Navy was not good that year. They couldn't lose. Army couldn't lose. There's no chance. They're absolutely going to roll our Navy. Please. Yeah, well, you get the idea. Army was upset, an absolutely brutal gut punch from their arch rival, keeping them from that glory. And now in Chapter 7, we are sifting through the fallout of that. This is entitled Blake's Boys. An unraveling had begun. The loss to Navy lingered at West Point for months, largely because of Blake, who remained inconsolable. He could not forget what had happened that bleak afternoon in Philadelphia, nor would he allow himself to try. He might as well have installed a navy blue neon sign on his furrowed forehead, flashing night and day, 14-2, 14-2. He compulsively rehashed the loss and replayed the game films looking for explanations. He had, quote, viewed the pictures and studied the individual performances of each man until the game is close to a nightmare. He confessed in a letter to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the West Point alumnus who by then had become the president of Columbia University. Blake's assistants had seen the game so many times that they had memorized the precise sequence from kickoff to final gun. Every mistake, every moment when Blake predictably stopped the film to draw an agonizing lesson one more time. It became ritualized, a morality play performed daily in the darkness of the projection room. The staff sat in the same seats and repeated yesterday's dialogue. Once, Murray Warmath blurted something out of turn and was chided by Lombardi, quote, "Hey, you stole my line." Navy was not supposed to win the game. They had not beaten Blake's Boys since 1943, but somehow every time the film ran to completion, the final score came out the same. Anything was possible now. The Blakean world of balance, order, and certitude seemed shaken and vulnerable to collapse. In football, there is a natural tendency to develop an us versus them complex, but now them was not just Navy. Blake believed there were forces inside West Point, especially officers in the tactical department, seeking to undermine his program and rid the academy of his best players. He noticed a warning sign before 1951 spring drills began in March, when Warmath accompanied several players to Manhattan for dinner at Leone's. During the meal, a West Point officer approached their table and berated the athletes, saying their social skills were embarrassingly deficient. As Warmath described the confrontation to Blake, the coach mused aloud that the message was meant not for his free-spirited boys so much as for him. He already seemed besieged when he was receiving word the following month of a casualty on the political battleground. On April 11th, his hero MacArthur was summarily fired from Supreme Command in the Far East by President Truman. The move was predictable yet shocking to the general's acolytes. For months, MacArthur had defiantly challenged military and foreign policy directives from the Pentagon and White House, pushing his troops beyond the defined limits in Korea and declaring that the United States had been too cautious in its dealings with China. Blake was among his most ardent supporters. Hours after the dismissal, he cabled MacArthur at Tokyo headquarters, quote, "American public is stunned. Time is of the essence to offset administration hatchet men. My affection and devotion to you," end quotes. In the weeks that followed, when he was not sitting in the darkness of the tower, witnessing grainy footage of the Navy fiasco, Blake busied himself with the task of ensuring that his favorite old soldier did not fade away. He believed that the best solution was for MacArthur to become the Republican candidate for president in 1952. Employing the metaphors of his sports universe, he wrote MacArthur that, quote, "The best hope for the future lies in fielding a new team in Washington." American military policy in Asia, he said, was, quote, "comparable to a football team with a strong ground game and air game, always punting on first down and through fear, presenting the initiative to the opponents," end quote. Now, long after MacArthur's forced return Sorry, I had to pause there. I thought I'd let you, as familiar viewers will know, that a few times ago I'd recorded an entire thing and it didn't actually record. I just had to double check. I'm going to be paranoid about that for literally the rest of my life. All right, I think we're good. We'll see how it goes. If we're not recording, you won't ever see this, and I won't have to worry about it. Okay. Whew. It was a real paranoid moment by me to have to check that. All right, where were we? Now, long after MacArthur's forced return, Blake visited him at his suite in exile atop the Waldorf Astoria Towers in Midtown Manhattan. At that meeting, Blake argued that the general, then 71, was not too old to run for president. Quote, "The years have touched you so lightly," he wrote in a follow-up letter, and it belittled the potential candidacy of MacArthur's longtime military competitor, General Eisenhower. As solicitous as the ever-political Blake was in his separate running correspondence with Eisenhower, his private opinions of Ike were cutting. Quote, "I like Ike. We all like Ike, but not as presidents," he wrote to one political associate that year. He called Eisenhower, quote, "the world's foremost compromiser," which in the political lexicon he had adopted from MacArthur was intended as a wounding insult. Lombardi watched Blake's maneuvers with only moderate interest. He was intrigued by Blake's readiness to transfer his philosophy to the political realm, awed by the strength of MacArthur's rhetoric, but less impressed with the specific politics. Since his days among the Jesuits on Rose Hill, Lombardi had been a Democrat, and he shared with fellow Fordham grad Tim Cohane, also a Democrat, an ability to draw lifelong lessons from Blake's philosophy and style without becoming submissive to his beliefs, to revere Saint Blake without following him blindly. The spring of 1951 was a difficult time to follow him at all. Given Blake's state of mind, agitated by the Navy loss and MacArthur's undoing, it was providential that Lombardi could escape West Point for a while. The opportunity came late in April, when he and 5 other members of the Army athletic staff were dispatched to the Orient to conduct football clinics. It began as a merry junket. The coaches lounged in luxury suites at the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco before boarding an old military transport plane that took them across the Pacific to Tokyo. The trip had been arranged before MacArthur's recall, during the days when he was trying to instill in the Japanese the traditions of American culture and democracy. The introduction of football, MacArthur thought, might ease the process. Lombardi and his colleagues were not burdened with the mission of selling democracy. Their goal was to teach football and enjoy the sights. Kenna, who had made several recruiting forays with Lombardi in the States, was not surprised to discover that Vince had connections in Tokyo. It seemed that wherever they traveled, there was an old Fordham man, usually an FBI agent. Fordham was a dependable supplier of federal gumshoes who knew the best places in town. Here it was even better. Vince found a Fordham man in charge of the officers' clubs in Tokyo. Quote, "Vin and I toured quite a few night spots that the other guys didn't get to," Kenna said later. Quote, "We had a good time. This guy took us everywhere." The football instruction was tedious. The Japanese had not played American football and were learning the game from scratch. They were earnest, if bewildered and undersized students, and Lombardi, as ever, was an aggressive teacher. For the most part, the instruction was mental rather than physical, which meant that he generally refrained from his hands-on methods of teaching blocking and tackling and avoid injuring a student or himself. After 3 weeks in Tokyo, the Army coaches received a surprise telephone call from Arnold Gallifa, the quarterback for the undefeated 1949 team, now a decorated aide to General Matthew Ridgway, who had taken over the supreme command from MacArthur. Gallifa passed along word that, quote, "the old man," in this case Ridgway, All brass in the military culture were the old man, wanted them to go to Korea and entertain the troops, quote, like a USO tour. Blake would never allow it, Kenna responded. The colonel was uncomfortable having his assistants away this long. Certainly they had more Navy film to examine back at the gym. No problem, Khalifa said. It was already arranged. Ridgway sent a plane to retrieve them in Tokyo and take them to the war zone. Lombardi was dressed in military guise, army fatigues at least, no stripes, green cap askew, though not on backward, the way the devilish war math wore it to irritate fuss-budget lieutenants. Their first experience in Korea was unnerving. At the landing strip near Seoul, an American jet fighter bomber came in right before them with its bombs jammed and about to explode. At military posts in Korea, they showed game films to the fighting men and told stories about the Army football team, the heroic backfield of Davis and Blanchard, how the cadets seemed loaded again at the recently completed spring drills, oozing with so much talent, said Lombardi, that, quote, no one in the country could touch us. From the troops, they heard accounts of war and countless tales about MacArthur. They kept the negative comments to themselves and remembered the positive for retelling to Blake back at West Point. Blake treasured a few things more than chances to praise and flatter his patron. Indeed, in his first letter to MacArthur after debriefing his assistants, Blake wrote, quote, this is the part that will interest you a great deal. They spoke with hundreds of soldiers, officers, as well as many civilians in Tokyo and Korea, and from all these sources, without exception, came words of respect and veneration for General MacArthur. Our coaches were amazed that it was so universal. What amazed them more was their nearness to real rather than symbolic warfare. One day the coaches were escorted by Army guides to advanced positions held by the 1st Marine Division under the command of Colonel Wilbert S. Bigfoot Brown. Here the distinction between football and war became patently obvious and made any equating of the two seem preposterous. Colonel Blake might draft battle plans in the secrecy of a tower, but he did not need the protective cover of sandbags piled 10 feet thick like Colonel Brown's command bunker. Troops on the right and left had given way to enemy thrusts. Bigfoot, shoe size 14E, and his Marines were holding the precarious line when the coaches arrived. They were invited to his command bunker for lunch. With lanterns illuminating the scene, the guests sat on canvas cots as a captain prepared meals over a Coleman stove, beans and franks. What the hell are we doing here? Warmath thought to himself. Just as the meal was to be served, an enemy bomb exploded nearby. Powerful concussion, lanterns knocked out, mess kits flying, food tossed. In the chaos of the moment, a shaken Lombardi reached up and felt, quote, an awful mess on his scalp. God, he shouted, my brains are coming out. He, quote, really thought he had been hit, recalled Kenna, who had been standing a few feet away, until, that is, he was informed that the hot mush simmering atop his head was not brain matter, but an airborne serving of baked beans. Lombardi's military sojourn had its comic aspect, but it was also truly frightening. He was a civilian facing enemy fire, an experience thousands of servicemen never encountered. After their Korean adventure, the coaches split up for more football clinics. Lombardi was sent to the Philippines with Paul Amon. Kenna and Warmath went to Okinawa. It was July by then, and they had been away about 2 months. Bull Pond would be coming soon, and then fall practice. Bull Pond is their little retreat that they all have together, along with Coach Blake in the off-season. Let's see. By the time Lombardi reunited with the others in Tokyo, he seemed eager to return to West Point and begin work with his talented corps. Messages awaited in Tokyo, one from Colonel Blake, urgent. Kenna called the old man, and when he hung up, he reported that Blake was, quote, absolutely sick and wanted the staff to get on back as quickly as possible. Something about football players and violations of the academic honor code. Details would come soon enough, but one thing was obvious to the coaches as they scrambled back to West Point. This might be worse than any loss to Navy. This was 1951, the beginning of what was later perceived through the lens of nostalgia as a decade of simplicity. This was West Point, garrison of traditional American values, duty, honor, country. And this was Coach Blake, the old man, demanding and austere. It would be easy for someone nearly 50 years later, discouraged by the corrupted state of sports in America at the end of the 20th century and unmindful of the cycles of history, to take a fleeting look at that combination and make a backward leap of faith. Now there was a time and place where sport was honest and clean, by the rules, when pride still mattered. But history has a way of mocking attempts to render it retroactively pure. That very Trinity, 1951, West Point, Red Blake, could also be remembered for one troubling event, a massive academic honor code violation that resulted in, among other things, the devastation of Blake's audacious football squad. Lombardi's role was peripheral. He was there and not there. He lived through the scandal and survived it unscathed. His name does not appear in a single document related to it, and he rarely spoke of it later in his career, as though he had repressed it. But the events of that episode are not immaterial to his larger story. They are central to understanding the mythology of Lombardi, the contradictory demands and expectations of football, and the fallacy of the innocent past. The trouble for Blake's boys began even before Lombardi and the other assistants left for the Far East, blissfully unaware. It was on the morning of April 2nd that an honor representative for the first class, or seniors, visited the office of Colonel Paul D. Harkins and reported that some cadets had formed a ring to pass along unauthorized academic information, meaning questions and answers, for daily quizzes and midterm reviews. The cadet told Harkins that his knowledge of the scheme came originally from a third-classman and member of the swim team whose own familiarity with the ring was more direct. He had been invited to join it. The swimmer believed that the ring was operated by football players. After declining the offer to join the conspiracy, he became concerned about reporting fellow cadets, but also realized that failure to do so would be a violation of the honor code. A cadet does not lie, cheat, or steal. A cadet who knows about someone who has lied, cheated, or stolen must report him for violating the code. That was the honor code, as old as West Point and enforced by the cadets themselves. It was revered as the foundation of the academy's integrity, drilled into every plebe from the first week of orientation at Beast Barracks. Colonel Harkins wrote a memorandum for the record detailing what he had been told about the ring and noting that he was, quote, indeed shocked to hear of such a thing. As Commandant of Cadets and head of West Point's tactical department, Harkins was responsible for transforming college students into soldiers. His background for the job was unquestioned. He had been trained at the side of General George S. Patton, for whom he had served as Deputy Chief of Staff with the Third Army during World War II, earning a nickname, the Ramrod, that reflected his determination to carry out Patton's wishes. In style and substance, he was more Patton's opposite, unemotional, and all by the book. What he excelled at was framing rules and following them. His feelings about Blake and football were decidedly negative. It was Harkins who had confronted Warmath during dinner at Leone's, offended by the behavior of young officers-to-be. He considered the football department a discredit to the academy. It was favored with special privileges, flouted the rules of the Corps, was stocked with athletes who belonged neither in college nor in the Army, also led by a coach whose power outstripped his position and whose rank exceeded his merit. Harkins was among the non-believers when it came to St. Blake. The word among these heretics was that Blake was at West Point when he could have been fighting in World War I and became a colonel as a matter of show. After being recruited from Dartmouth to build the football program, he was recommissioned as an officer and during the war insisted on status equal to Navy's coach. It was with that frame of reference that Harkins received the tip that Blake's football squad might be involved in an academic scandal, and he responded with zeal. He quickly called a meeting of his immediate staff. Quote, we had no tangible evidence and knew we would have to get some before we could prove anything, he wrote later in a confidential memorandum. Quote, we discussed means and methods. We thought of everything from recording systems and hidden mics to having someone join the ring. They decided to fight fire with fire by asking the swimmer and two other trusted cadets to infiltrate the ring. The swimmer agonized about becoming a, quote, stool pigeon. The request, he said later, seemed, quote, unfair, unnecessary, and undignified. However, is the West Point yearling privileged to doubt the judgment of the Commandant of Cadets? He contacted an uncle, a corporate lawyer in New York, who drove to West Point that weekend to counsel him. They strolled up the path to Michie Stadium and stood by the low wall surrounding Lusk Reservoir as the cadet calmly outlined his dilemma. He said he felt trapped and wanted to quit West Point. His uncle urged him not to leave under fire since he had done nothing wrong. Quote, "Do as the colonel says." The tormented cadet agreed to go along with Harkin's plan. By early May, the swim team cadet and other informants had gathered solid evidence on a handful of classmates and believed that as many as 50 to 100 cadets were involved, most of them connected to the football team. Unauthorized information about tests, they told Harkins, was being, quote, passed freely at the football tables in the dining hall. They also said the ringleaders appeared to have rigged the system by strategically placing a few tainted cadets on the 25-member committee that enforced the honor code. Professors of Spanish, mechanics, and physics presented Harkins with evidence that test questions in their classes appeared to be known in advance. As the month wore on, rumors spread that a scandal was about to explode. Members of the ring became suspicious of the infiltrators and ostracized them. Harkins decided it was time to act. He went to Major General Frederick A. Irving, the Academy's new superintendent, and received approval to launch an official investigation. 3 officers were appointed to a board of inquiry led by Harkins's ally in the tactical department, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur S. Collins, Jr., who shared his distaste for Blake and big-time Army football. The board targeted 14 cadets suspected of involvement in the ring and brought them in to testify under oath one by one, starting at 7 o'clock in the morning on May 29th. The first witness was a third-classman who confessed immediately. Quote, "I first heard about this ring during 4th class, his freshman year or plebe year, in 1949, he began. He went on to say that the ring, quote, was started by football players for football players, and that rings operated in both the 1st and 2nd regiments. The way the process worked, he testified, was that ring members who took a writ or daily quiz in an early period would pass along the questions to cadets who were to take the same writ later in the day. If there was time, the answers were then worked out by smarter members of the ring and slipped to cadets who were struggling academically. Quote, everyone has been scared to death since they have an idea it is going to break, the cadet said in concluding his testimony. This first witness turned out to be the most forthcoming of the 14. The second said he knew nothing about a cribbing ring. The third said he would not say anything until he talked to Coach Blake. Quote, I'll tell you anything about myself, but if it is football players you're asking about, I won't squeal, he added. Quote, there are people around here who don't like football players. My tactical officer is one of them. The remaining first-day witnesses insisted that they knew nothing of a ring. The next afternoon, as Blake strode across the plain to attend a baseball game, his son Bob played second base, he encountered a football player who nonchalantly mentioned an honor code investigation. To Blake, it sounded minor, perhaps involving one cadet. He learned otherwise that night in an urgent phone call from another player saying that several sophomores needed to see him immediately. At 9:15, he was up in the projection room of the gymnasium tower listening to 12 of his players tell him about the ring and their appearances before the board of inquiry. They said they were confused and would do whatever Blake advised. By all accounts, he directed them to return to the board and tell the whole truth. Quote, you know how we do business in the squad and at the military academy, he said. Quote, each one of you should state the facts to the board without equivocation. When the players left, Blake remained in the film room, alone in the dark. Lombardi and his other assistants were on the other side of the world. His mentor, MacArthur, was off giving rousing political speeches. Quote, no foreboding could have been greater than my own, Blake later wrote of the dismay that overwhelmed him at that moment. Quote, I had been in many a tough game, but this was not a game. It was a catastrophe. End quotes. That's all the time we have for today. Disastrous for our Army. I have a feeling Army's going to, pull things out. Not necessarily the football team, but like the actual Army. They're going to be all right. More coming tomorrow. Again, thank you so much for being with us, and we just hope that you're well, you're staying safe. By staying isolated, you're doing a huge service to everyone in our community, everyone in our region, our state, our country, and our world. So thank you for doing that. All right, back tomorrow with more. Cannot wait for When Pride Still Matters. Have a great day.